What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to the vlog, I guess is what I'm going to be calling it for the time being. This is episode 25 for season 3. I know I got one of the episode numbers wrong in a previous video. For Friday, August 27th, 2021. And today's show is kind of, well, kind of the same as it usually is. Got a couple announcements. Got an update on the 1.4 R5 firmware, and I want to talk a little bit about some stuff that I've been working on and stuff that I have had run into with that. So let's kick off with the announcement that I want to make, which is I am starting a new series of videos. So I've been doing this R5 tips series, and it's not ending, but I'm going to dial it back a little bit, and I'm going to be starting a new series of videos talking about lighting technologies and lighting for video. And the first episode is already recorded, and it's scheduled to publish on September 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That's my standard publishing time for non-vlog videos. And broadly speaking, this series is intended to be sort of a brain dump of everything I've learned about lighting, trying to figure out lighting for shooting video, as a low budget, as a YouTuber, as, you know, not trying to do crazy cinema, RE sky panel, $10,000 lighting stuff. Now, granted, I have gotten into some more high-end lights. I'm currently using Aperture LS120s, which are not exactly cheap. Um, and I'm going to talk about eventually in this series how I've ended up where I've ended up, why I've ended up where I have, and the decision processes that I made, the things that you should probably consider if you're looking to buy lights or lighting, what you actually need, because while I've ended up at fairly expensive lights, I did not shoot the vast majority, actually, of all of the content that I shot until this year has been shot with some staggeringly cheap lighting equipment. And quite honestly, I think the quality of the light is pretty good for the kind of investment that I put into it. So what I won't be covering in this series more than likely is how to actually light, how to position lights, how lights work. That's something I'm still up in the air about. I'm not entirely sure about whether I want to do it in this series or just start an entirely new series on that after I get through sort of the technology stuff. That's kind of where I'm leaning right now. So I may just roll right through lighting technology and then right into sort of application or how to light things or lighting things. So that's the announcement. Moving on to the second thing I wanted to talk about, which is an update on the Canon R5 1.4 firmware. So I installed it earlier this week. I have been shooting with it, and I basically can report that there aren't any problems that I have run into. The only thing that I would make a note of as a thought or consideration for this firmware or for the update is do use a fully charged battery. There have been reports, some people online have reported that the firmware update takes a very long time to get started. Now, someone even saying it took them 2 cups of coffee, but I don't know how long it takes somebody to drink a cup of coffee, because that's kind of a personal thing, I guess. On my camera, so this one with the battery grip on it, I basically it took a couple minutes. It ran through the update process pretty much as fast as the camera could run through the update process. About 1% per second, so it was about 2 minutes ish, a little under 2 minutes for the thing to actually step through. So 2 to 3 minutes, which is not a real problem. On another R5 that I updated, it took a little bit longer to get started, but still, I think the whole process was done in under 5 minutes. So if somebody's drinking 2 cups of coffee in under 5 minutes, they've got way more caffeine in them than I do. But that's just something to be aware of. There have been people that have reported it sat at 0% for quite a while, and then it ticks off pretty regularly. But just as always, start the process with a fully charged battery. Now, obviously, the big selling points, features for the camera, the raw video recording on the Ninja 5 Plus, and the ability to autofocus the CNE zooms. I don't have either of those. I don't have a Ninja 5 Plus. I don't use CNE zooms, so I can't test those. So those are untested as far as I'm concerned. The improper image stabilization on the first frame, in looking at reports, I'm seeing a lot of people that are saying that yes, it's fixed, that works properly, so that seems to be a good thing. As I said, I couldn't really reliably produce an unstabilized first frame in my shooting, but that also, image stabilization, as I've said in the past, is an incredibly complicated system and process, and because it's dependent on how shaky you are and what you're doing and how fast you're trying to make things happen, you can have two people can have completely different results with a otherwise functional camera. But I'm not seeing any major bugs. I'm not seeing any major problems. Canon didn't pull the firmware. I'm not seeing any reports from people saying that it's bricking their cameras, or it's breaking something, or something major isn't working. So 1.4 looks like it's a solid upgrade at this point. If you are sitting on the fence waiting to see how things play out, certainly it's played out fine on my camera. Okay, so moving into the third topic that I want to talk about, which or in a few days, or next week, or something to that effect. Let me check real quick. So yeah, September 1st and September 6th, my R5 series of tips and tricks is going to be talking about focus stacking, because one of the features that's added to the R5 and R6 is the ability for the camera to auto-generate a focus stack set. Now, a camera can't do the actual compositing everything into a focus stack, but it can do the focus shifts and taking images. And so I'm going to be talking through how to do that. And one of the things that always, basically what I discovered again, as usual, is that focus stacking is one of those things. This is like, okay, so the great thing about digital photography, in my opinion, is the ability to throw computational resources at it. So I can shoot a focus stack. I can shoot a focus stack at, say, f2 or f2.8 and get really nice bokeh in the background, but still have way more depth of field than ever you could have functionally at that aperture. And potentially even better than you would have with a tilt shift lens at f2.8 tilted. The problem with focus stacking and other computational photography things is that there's an inherent unreliability, I find, to it. And that's what I found here. Photoshop's focus blending or focus stacking capabilities is basically as unreliable as I ever remember it being. In fact, it might have been worse, because I shot 3 or 4 sets of focus stacks for this video, and I don't think any of them came out without some issue somewhere in the focus stack. So now, obviously, part of the problem, well, all of the problem here is Photoshop. It's not the camera, because the camera's just making images with different focus positions. Part of the problem with this, it goes back to, and I've talked about this with let's say the R5 even, is technology becomes more complicated. It becomes an even more generalist tool. The ability for it to do specialized things extremely well generally tends to diminish. So Photoshop is a fantastic image manipulation program that's used from everything from commercial retouching of photography all the way to digital painting. And it strives, I feel, to be very good at all of this stuff. However, when you get into very specific niche things, like, for example, say focus stacking, I'm not convinced that Photoshop is the best option out there. It's the option I have. When I was doing these videos, I didn't want to get into like Helicon Focus or third-party apps to try and do focus stacking, even though, I should maybe investigate that, and that may be worth doing a video on in the future. I have Photoshop. I intended to use Photoshop, and that's kind of what I did. And like I said, in everything I ran into, Photoshop had problems. It did things wrong. Like, I would very clearly places in the photo that should have been taken from a layer that was in focus got taken from a layer that was completely out of focus. And I would have a perfectly in focus thing except for one place in the middle of the subject that would be out of focus. Now, of course, the way Photoshop does this with layers and layer masks does mean that it is possible to kind of go in and manipulate the layer masks to fix this up manually if you absolutely have to. And I played around with that for a little bit, but boy, is that a really challenging operation to try and do. So it's certainly possible, but it's far from ideal. So if this is where I go back to, I like the idea of focus stacking. I probably should shoot more focus stacking. I've now put some time into writing a tool for focus stacking to calculate the number of exposures. At Photoshop, maybe I was shooting close-up photography. Photoshop may be more reliable at doing like landscapes. I don't know. I got into focus stack. The funny thing is I got into focus stacking a long time ago. I kind of played with it for a while, but it was a real pain because the cameras didn't do the stacking, couldn't generate the image sets automatically. And as a result, I would find that just trying to tweak the focus manually, I would run into where I'd have gaps in my focus stack. So it would be sharp, 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 out of focus, sharp, 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 because I missed getting the focus in the right place. And now that I have a camera that can actually do the stacks and do it quickly and do it effectively, I'm going to have to play around now on the software side of things to see if I can get that to kind of work right. Which brings me, boy, I think this is going to be a short episode, but this brings me to talking about, I think one of my biggest frustrations with Canon, it's not really a frustration with Canon because it's not really their fault. They don't have control over what third parties do. But my note here is literally Canon's dual pixel RAW is the secret weapon. It is Canon's secret weapon, but it's just doesn't get actually pushed or used. And when I remember when dual pixel RAW first came out, having discussions with photographers who were talking about basically it was a gimmick and they didn't care and nobody should use it and it's a waste of time and blah blah blah, because Canon was marketing it as having bokeh shift and focus micro adjustments, which it can do. And you can do that in Digital Photo Professional, and it works. And it works better if you shoot with a very fast lens. And this is where my response at that time was, it's only a gimmick because you don't fall into that to these photographers that I was talking. It's only a gimmick because you don't fall into the market that actually needs it. So if you actually are in a market where being able to make incredibly fine or precise adjustments to focus placement after the fact is important, for example, say fashion or portraiture or whatever, where if the focus is just slightly in front of the eye and you can push it just slightly onto the eye, and it's a post-processing step, it becomes incredibly useful. What has subsequently rolled out of dual pixel RAW is from what I'm seeing is it could be incredibly useful for other things, and it's just not being dealt with. And I would love to be in a position to write software to start messing with some of this stuff, because for example, it would make focus stacking very interesting, which I'll come back to in a second. But I just don't have the mathematical programming chops to understand the nuances or the ins and outs of decoding the raw files, getting the information out of it, doing whatever processing, etc. I lack it. But what subsequently has come out is, for example, Fast Raw Viewer, I believe. I don't think that's the name of the company, but the company that makes Fast Raw Viewer discovered that the way Canon's reading out the sensor for dual pixel RAW, you can recover an extra stop of highlight detail, basically extending the dynamic range for free. And it works because Canon reads out the sensor, or the subpixels, if you will, or the sensor at 14 bits. And the sensors, including the subpixels, so the half subpixels, are capable of providing 14 bits worth of information. However, when the dual pixel raw files put together, the two halves of the sensor data are summed together into a 14-bit value. So basically, basically, if you sum two 14-bit numbers together, you need a 15-bit number to hold all of the possible values. So you can think, without talking binary, if we talk just straight up like numbers that we're used to, base 10, decimal, if you have two two-digit numbers, so say 50 and 50, and you sum them together, you get 100, so you need a three-digit number to hold that. And so even if you go all the way up to 99 plus 99, that's 198, that gives you, it's a three-digit number. So you'll never, you need one more digit, essentially, or one more bit in binary to hold everything together. So the way Canon did their dual pixel RAW, and I have to admit, I kind of agree with the way they put the file together, is they save two subframes in the file. One subframe is the A plus B subpixel, so the sum of the subpixels, and it's a 14-bit value is what they got out of that. And that's basically just right there, straight up, every other Canon RAW file. So basically every piece of software that's out there that can read a Canon RAW file can read a Canon dual pixel RAW file, with only being told where to go to look for the A plus B subframe. So, and I'm not even sure that it's not stored in the same metadata container, header, offset, etc., as a regular Canon RAW file, a non-dual pixel RAW file would store it. The other subframe in the file is just the B pixel, so it's just half of the information that's being read out by the sensor, or half of the sum. So it's the one side of each dual pixel, and that's stored also as 14-bit values, and they can be all the way up to the maximum of a 14-bit file, of a 14-bit value. Well, that means that if I have a clipped value in the A plus B part, I can look at the B part, see what that is, and that tells me, well, it does two things. First of all, because it's only collecting half of the light area on the sensor, it's essentially operating at half of the exposure. So exposure for the sensor is for the total light, or the total area of the sensor. If you block half of the sensor off, it's basically like stopping the lens down by a stop. You get half of the amount of light. So now all of a sudden, dual pixel RAW gives you this ability to recover highlight detail and a stop worth of highlight detail, just by being able to process out look at what the subpixel's doing. And this is one of those things. So there's this program, DPR split. I'm going to be talking about this all in the R5 tips thing eventually. But there's a program out there. It's free. It's DPR split, and it will extract the B frame, the second subframe, and allow you to stack it with the original to make an HDR, which gives you essentially an extra stop worth of highlight recovery or highlight information that you didn't normally have in the file. Now, obviously Canon could have done things differently. They could have certainly done A frame, B frame, and not had the combined frame. I have a feeling that the combined frame thing is a bit of a bone being thrown to third parties, because I think as much as Canon would like everybody to use their software, I think they realize that a lot of photographers use third-party software, and not making it incredibly difficult for or any more difficult than it has to be for third parties to update, to use dual pixel RAW, in theory, makes it easier for, the camera or the format to be more widely used. But what got me thinking about all of this dual pixel RAW stuff is the dual pixel RAW file can potentially be reversed to make a distance or focus mask. And this goes back to, I started thinking about this when I was having all these problems with Photoshop, because the way focus stacking in Photoshop, because the way focus stacking works now is the image is evaluated for the sharpest areas, and those areas are what's masked as being the in focus part of the image. And I mean, it's certainly more complicated than that, but the software has no idea what actually is in focus. It can only tell what is sharp. Basically, the only thing that you have after the fact, looking at a picture in Photoshop, is contrast-based autofocus. Well, except it's not autofocusing. So you're looking for the highest contrast, local contrast, which is the highest, gives you the highest or the sharpest areas, which gives you the ability to say, okay, this is what's in focus. But the dual pixel RAW file, essentially, at least I'm thinking, in my thinking at least, and again, I'd love to write the software to try this and figure it out, but I don't have the chops to do it, basically, is the dual pixel RAW file. So when Canon evaluates focus on a dual pixel sensor, they're reading out each half of the sensor, and they're comparing basically the signal levels of each half of the sensor. And they do some math, and that tells them the phase difference, basically the same way as a phase autofocus sensor would in a DSLR, or embedded phase pixels do in, say, like a Sony mirrorless. Only with the dual pixel sensor in Canon, it's doing it at every pixel, or it's capable of doing it at every pixel. It doesn't have to have certain areas that have autofocus capabilities, or or drop the contrast base or whatever. It's always doing phase calculations. But there's nothing inherently special, as far as I can tell, about what Canon does in the calculations. So they're reading out the two halves of the sensor. There's nothing otherworldly magical about that. And we basically have that information in a dual pixel RAW file. So we have the B, like we call it the B subpixel data, and we have the A plus B subpixel data, which we can subtract the B subpixel data from to get the A subpixel data. And that broadly would give us, like I said, A and B, what the values are. And from that, and I think, and again, I don't have the chops necessarily to calculate this or do this, but from that, you should be able to calculate a focus mask, essentially, of what actually is and isn't in focus, that you could then turn to take into, say, a focus stacking application, and use that as the mask for the pixels that you're actually going to take for each layer of the stack. Because what I would see, one of the problems that I would see in my focus stacks is that if I had For example, a table surface with detail on it, I would find that the table surface would get blurred out outside of where the object was, even though the table surface should have been in focus in each one of, or was in focus and should have been part of each one of those stacks. Because for whatever reason, the algorithm that Photoshop was using just couldn't wrap its head around this other area being in focus, because it was either too bright or too dark or too whatever for Photoshop to care, for Photoshop to realize. But if we had a focus mask generated from the raw data, from the dual pixel sensor, from the camera, then it becomes very, like, anything that was in focus is in focus because of the way that you're essentially the way everything essentially works. So you would have the ability to do focus stacking where, instead of guessing at what should be in the stack because it's the sharpest, I mean, you may still want to apply a threshold to things, you could actually know this area here or this area here or this area here or whatever. Those are all in focus and they should all be included in this layer of the stack. So, and this is why, like I said, this is why I feel like it's a little bit frustrating to me to sort of it's frustrating to me to see sort of this whole thing going on. And I don't, like, I know everybody wants to blame Canon for everything, but or not doing everything. And I'm not really sure that it's entirely their fault. That for one thing, nobody ever wants to talk about or consider patents, which I hate software patents. By and large, software patents seem to be something that's dying to a certain extent in the US, that at least. But I think they still are there. They're still available. Like, if you have something that's really novel, software patents, I think, still can be there to cover it. And this is one of the perpetual problems of, like, trying to suggest features to a camera company, is then they start worrying about lawsuits. And like, again, I don't blame them, because there has been plenty of instances in the past of companies or people or something suggesting something or pushing something to a company or an organization. I mean, the one that jumps to mind, it's a company, not necessarily a person, was what Rambus did in the early 2000s. Rambus memory, if you remember, Pentium 4s were, Intel was tied to Rambus. Rambus went into JEDEC, the standards body for DRAM, and started pushing all these, like, great ideas. We could do this, and we have this would be available or whatever. And they never disclosed, I mean, among other things that they didn't do or did, but they didn't disclose to JEDEC that they had patents on this stuff. And so the memory manufacturer, the standards body would ratify a new DRAM standard. And the new DRAM standard included stuff that Rambus had patents on. And then Rambus turned around and said, well, everybody needs to pay us royalties because we have patents on this, which they didn't disclose. So it was a bad faith negotiation or a bad faith operation in the first place, which they didn't disclose. And so, like, I mean, I perfectly understand camera companies' reluctance to sort of take advice or take ideas on, considering the litigious nature of, look at Canon's a big company. They got a lot of money. Sony's a big company. They got a lot of money. Even Nikon, who really isn't that big of a company, but they still have a lot of money compared to, me or most people watching this. So if I had no ethics and I could get Canon to implement something that I'm sort of pushing as a great idea of things that we should have in cameras, and I happen to just have a patent on it, and I don't really disclose that because, hey, that would not, that would be ethical. And then I turn around and sue them, even if they just settle, like, to make me go away, and I get $1 million or $250,000 or $500,000 or whatever. That was a cost for them to implement stuff. So I don't necessarily blame Canon. And part of this is even if Canon's implementing this stuff, I don't use their software. I use Lightroom. That I've got Digital Photo Professional installed. I can drop into it if I need to for whatever reason. I never have because I don't really find it to be very good software. It may technically be the best software for processing Canon files in a technical sense, but it's not the software that is the best workflow for me. And like I've said this over and over in photography is not to get too caught up in having the technical best, because if getting the technically the best image means that you can't process as many images, or you can't produce the images, or you hate dealing with your images, then that few percentage points of better in the image technically isn't really going to be beneficial to you. So the flip side is, I use Lightroom from Adobe, and Adobe barely supports dual pixel RAW at all. In fact, they barely have any interesting technology really going into Lightroom that you see in manufacturer software. So another perfect example, and this has nothing to do with dual pixel RAW files, is Canon software, Digital Photo Professional, and Nikon software. I don't even remember what it's called. And I think Sony software, and I'm pretty sure Phase 1 software, Capture One, for their cameras, all support chromatic or diffraction correction. It will reverse the softening effect of diffraction on your images. And when I tested this years ago with my 5D Mark IVs, it worked really, really well. Like, I was floored by how good diffraction correction worked. And I could shoot at f22 and get an image that was just as sharp as shooting at f8 anywhere else, on that lens. Lightroom doesn't have that at all. Doesn't include that capability. If you want diffraction correction, and I don't see any reason why Adobe couldn't add it in. It may take a while. It may take time for them to add the transforms into their library from profiling lenses and whatnot, but it's not there. Likewise, they don't give you the ability to recover that extra stop of dynamic range, even though it's right under them in the taking. Now, I mean, maybe it has something to do with the fact that Lightroom doesn't want to give one brand an advantage over another brand or something, or Adobe doesn't want to be seen to play favorites or something like that. And so since Canon has dual pixel RAW and nobody else does, and that gives Canon potentially an advantage to do these things with the dual pixel RAW that nobody else can, Adobe's just going to avoid doing anything with it because, well, then it looks like they're playing favorites to Canon and not Nikon or Sony or anybody else. I don't know. And the part of the problem here, in some respects, at least on the Lightroom case, is that there's no good coherent there's no good coherent place in photography software at all to get everything happening together. It would be great if Lightroom supported actual third-party processing or develop raw generation code. So Canon or Nikon or anybody could potentially write a library that you put into Lightroom, and instead of using the Adobe RAW, debayer, etc. process, use the OEM like Canon, Nikon, etc. process to generate the base image information, to go from a RAW file to an RGB file that you basically can process. And in that process, we in theory would have the ability that, Canon could write their Lightroom plugin or Lightroom rendering, develop, whatever you want to call it, rendering module as to support diffraction correction, to support the dual pixel raw focus shift or micro adjustment and bokeh adjustments, and potentially whatever else. But like I said, it's somewhat frustrating to me that, I mean, I could be completely off base, I guess, is what it comes down to. I could just totally not have any idea because, as I said, I don't have the chops to write the software to even prove out whether or not what my thinking is actually works. I don't have the mathematical foundations anymore. I'm just not there. But getting people who are in one place to make it easier for the photographer to get from place to place without having to go, like, it's not invented here syndrome, really. I mean, to a certain extent, it's, you end up with, well, I can do all of this in Lightroom, but if I want to do this, I have to take it out to this program and then bring it back, or move it to here, or use this other program. And, you know, like I said, it's really, again, specialist tools are good in my opinion because they do what they're supposed to do or what they're designed to do really well. That's the whole point of specialist tool. What is lacking in some respects, and again, in my case, the blame lays squarely on Adobe, is a good, clean, efficient, straight up way to integrate a specialist tool into the more general product. But anyway, that was my thought, and that's this week's vlog. And so I'm going to wrap it up here. If you thought this was interesting or found it insightful, please consider smashing that like button. As always, please consider subscribing. And as always, I really need to stop saying as always twice there. But anyway, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.